Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University and Rabbi Marc Gellman of South Florida, joining us today for Torah study. Thank you for being part of our Torah study this morning. This morning we are reading through the preparations for the Exodus. And what is remarkable in the story is told in the Torah is that there's an oscillation and alternation between an accounting of the events of the last three of the plagues of darkness and then the killing of the firstborn, the last of the plagues, and the instructions to the people Israel that this story must be preserved, that this story must be retold, that this story must be reiterated in ritual, that this is the story that will be told through the generations that forms and shapes the internal life of the Jewish people. And the Mishnah, the rabbinic tradition, took that commandment of the Torah, V'yigadata lebincha, you will tell your child on that day, this is what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. It was the rabbinic tradition that made of this the singular command that we are to tell the story of the Exodus not as a historical event that happened a long time ago in a place far away, but it happened to us, that we were there, that we were part of the ritual, that we witnessed these events. You tell it in the first person and you tell it in the present tense. And that gives us our Seder ritual. Because the Seder ritual is ultimately what? It is ultimately a reiteration, a rehearsal once again, of the last night we were in Egypt. We are sitting in our homes. There's blood on the doorpost. The angel of death is circulating through the neighborhoods of Egypt. And we sit praying inside, hoping that we are safe, getting ourselves ready for the Exodus that is surely to come at the end of the evening with the breaking of dawn. So the question is, what does it mean to say that? That I was there, that I was part of the event, that I saw these things. How is that possible? And what does it mean? What does it do for us to join the event, not simply as someone who's commemorating it, but as a participant in the event? Rabbi Gellman, what does that mean? What does that commandment demand of us?
Well, the first thing, and Franz Rosenzweig understood this and wrote about it in his Star of Redemption, is that our sense of the rhythm of time is different than ordinary time. It's not historical time. The history of the Jewish people is a history of a relationship, of a covenant with God, and that the rhythms, the ebb and flow of that relationship occurs, according to Rosenzweig, and I completely agree with his take on this, outside of ordinary time. Outside of ordinary time. Certain religions have a way, certain languages have a way of expressing this, actually. In German, there's Erlebnisse and Erfahrungen, and which means the first is to go somewhere and the second is to have a journey, a metaphysical journey. In Greek, there's two words for time: chronos, which develops into our idea of chronology, in which each little segment of time is equal. It's time as measured by a clock, chronos. And the other is kairos. Kairos is filled time, what the German philosopher Hegel called a kind of numinous time, a filled time, and a time with telos in it, with purpose. So the first lesson is that this is different than a historical event. The Exodus may or may not have been a historical event. I believe it was, but there's no evidence, direct archaeological evidence of it. But it's for us a totally different thing. It's an event that lives beyond time, and the commandment to see yourself as if you left Egypt yourself is a way of, I call it it's like an existential rabbit hole. You're reading along and you're prepared believe, all right, I'm reading an old story. It's our story. I love the story, but it's a story about what happened to old people, old dead people long ago. Then all of a sudden, you come to this and it says, no, no, this happened to you. You were at Sinai. You and all souls that ever lived were at Sinai. Now wrap your head around that. And of course, you cannot wrap your head around it, but you must wrap your head around it. Otherwise, it's just an old story. So for me, this is the greatest rabbit hole of the Torah. It sucks us out of ordinary time and into a world in which the existence of our souls predated our birth and also will survive our death. So the journey of our souls, all the souls that ever were, the Otsar HaNeshamot, this treasure house of the souls, the pinnacle of all that was Sinai. And I don't believe we can have the faith we have in God, the trust we have in God, the connection we have with God, unless we believe that we all left Egypt and we all stood at Sinai.
Yashikoach, Marc. What I would say about your question, Ed, which is we're commanded to retell the story. And I'm fascinated by the research of Tal Ben-Shahar, who is a well-known psychologist. His class, the happiness class, was one of the most attended at Harvard. And he talks a lot about what does it mean to reframe our stories. So we're commanded to retell the story, and we have to reframe it to try to make it make sense. Except this story doesn't make sense. It's completely messy. Why did this happen? There's all these gaps and holes, and we're supposed to retell it with all these holes. And I actually think there's a larger message here, which is that most of our stories in our life that we retell, we work to make them cogent, because most of them are not. Most of our life human stories have a lot of bumps and things we don't understand in the moment and don't realize why it happened, whether it's a loss or a divorce or a financial upheaval. We have all these moments that don't make sense. Why? Where we want to say, why did this happen to me? And actually what the Torah is teaching us is that our stories don't make sense. And what we do when we retell the story is we attempt at both recognizing the incoherence of the story, but also an attempt to make it cogent, so that we can not only describe it as a story that happened, but that a story that continues to happen in our lives. And so we become actually a player in the story, an actor within the drama. We become someone in the narrative rather than just a storyteller or an observer or a journalist. We're actually in it, which is, if you think about it, quite beautiful, because someday our great-grandchildren will tell the story of us. And they'll say there was these 3 rabbis that got together and did this thing on Saturday mornings, and why they did it didn't really make sense, because they'll forget the part about the pandemic, or it won't be about the pandemic, but there will be another story and we will be the players and they'll be able to put themselves in it. So that's what I think is the lesson.
It's the difference between history and memory. History are events that happened, and we can organize them and we can structure them and we can figure out what their relationship is among these different events, but they remain at an arm's distance. When they become memory, they become ours, and they shape us and they change us and they condition us to walk the world in a certain way. And the commandment to say, I was there, is the commandment to make a historical event memory. And what Sherry's talking about is that when we make that move, when we take any historical event and bring it inward and make it memory, we structure it in a certain way. We have to make a certain set of choices about what we're going to remember, how we're going to tell the story, and what lessons we're going to remember. I think it's significant, very significant.
Wait, Eddie, this is why you're such a good rabbi. Because what I said was like, okay, but then you reframed it and told this dichotomy or difference between history and memory. And literally, as you said that, it was like,
I hope you're okay.
No, that's the difference. There's
yeah.
observing history like you're taking a class, and then
Right.
there's memory, which is like your soul is deeply interested and connected and invested in the story.
Right. The question, though, is how do you construct the story? Because stories can be, hang on one second, because stories can be constructed in different ways. What's significant to me is that when the rabbis of the Mishnah constructed the Pesach Seder and gave us the Haggadah is not about the horrors of slavery. The Haggadah is about the glory of liberation. Now, that was such an interesting idea. You know, you have a Seder plate. You get married in a Jewish synagogue, you get 100 of them. You have a Seder plate. The Seder plate only has one portion of bitter herbs, of maror. It has all the rest of it has to do with liberation. Now, you could have had a very different Seder, and we would have been a different people if the Seder plate had 5 portions of bitter and only 1 portion of sweet. But the idea that you choose to remember not the horror of slavery and the oppression of slavery and the humiliation of slavery, although that's part of the background story, but you remember instead the power and glory of the moment of liberation, that's what the story is told. Even in the Torah, that's the way the story is told. That's quite remarkable. That's a statement about how we are to look upon life and how we are to walk the world.
It's the same with Hanukkah. Do we tell the story of the battle and the brutality, or do we really tell the story of the candle and the little miracle that lasted for 8 nights, right? How we retell the story is the reframing for our time. Go ahead, Marc.
Yeah. Look, the idea of putting rabbit holes in your sacred text that pull you out of ordinary time and into sacred time, which is the point I'm making here, a la Rosenzweig. It's not just Jewish. This is not just Jewish. This is a human need. It's a natural human response to the need to worship and believe in God and to participate in the mystery of God. And the example I would give to show you how this is not just Jewish is the Eucharist feast of the Christians. For the Eucharist feast of the Christians, the Mass, the bread and the wine, this isn't just, we're having some bread because Jesus had bread with his followers, and so we have bread. And Jesus had wine with his followers so that we have wine. That would be a normal way to celebrate an old story in a performative way for people who see the Haggadah and Passover in a what I would call theologically limited way. That's it. That's how they see it. But there's another way, and that is the Christian belief, which of course we do not share, but they share with each other, is that you are not consuming bread. You're not consuming bread, you're consuming the body of Christ. You're not consuming wine, you're consuming the blood of Christ. Now, explain how that can happen. Well, you can't. It's a mystery for them, and it's not a mystery for us. So, Tommy and I would talk, and I would try and understand what the mystery of the Eucharist was for him. And he tried to explain it to me, but he couldn't, because it was a mystery at the root of his faith. And I couldn't explain to him what it meant that I was at Sinai. I couldn't explain that because he knew where I lived. He knew all my addresses. Most of those days we were giving the speeches or playing golf. And the truth of the matter is he couldn't understand it. But I said, no, but this is our mystery. And what it does is it changes religion from just primitive history, people would say before Thucydides, into something that is eternal, that goes through all cultures and through all times, because its demand upon us is a demand to not just retell an old story about old dead people, it's a demand to enter your life into the story itself so that you are not a teller of the story at all. You are a participant in it.
But the question I'm interested in, Marc, and maybe you can help us understand this, is how does a community, or for that matter, how does an individual take history and structure it and make the decisions about what we shall remember and what lessons we shall draw? I'll give you two quick examples, okay? A contemporary example and a little bit older example. My teacher, Harold Schulweis, in 1963, met a man named Fritz Graebe, who saved 5,000 Jews during the Holocaust. It's an Oskar Schindler story. He had a construction company and he was able to rescue Jews. And Harold became, at that point, obsessed. I mean, just obsessed with this question of Christian rescuers during the Holocaust. And that became one of his causes. Every time he would speak about this, he got such pushback from the community, terrible pushback, because the community wanted to tell the Holocaust story as a story of unmitigated darkness and evil. And Harold was very worried that if that's the legacy we leave for our children, they will not remember the story. They don't want to be participants in a story of unmitigated evil. And particularly if you turn to the non-Jewish world and say, you were at fault, that doesn't cause them to rise up in a moral way. It doesn't help them inspire them. But if you say to them, there was Oskar Schindler and Sempo Sugihara and Raoul Wallenberg and Joop Westerval and thousands of Christians, and then Muslims too, by the way, who saved Jews during the Holocaust, you change the story. He got so much pushback. So the question that our community is fighting right now, and we're going to have to make this, it's a very poignant momentary issue, because very soon the last of the survivors will be gone. And when we sit down to tell the story of the Shoah, the Holocaust, what story shall we tell? The other example of the same thing just happened very recently. The New York Times put up this idea called the 1619 Project, which told the American story, but from the point of view of those who were enslaved by America, and talked about America's very difficult and racist relationship with Native Americans, with indigenous peoples, with African Americans. And the president, the former president, objected to this and created what he called the 1776 Project, which told a very different story about America. Which story do we tell about our America? Who are our heroes in this story? How does a community structure history so that it becomes fruitful memory? Sherre, go ahead.
What I would say is that I think historically, Jews have reframed the story to be one of survival. And what we've seen in the last 50 years is, like Harold Schulweis, like Steven Spielberg, reframing stories to be one of thriving instead of surviving. And I can see why I was met with criticism, because you don't want to overplay the thriving in the unmitigated disaster. But you have to also want the story to be told again and again and carried on through the generations. And if you only tell the story of survival, or you tell it in such a way that no one wants to repeat it, you have to contend with that as well. So I love this idea that we're balancing telling the story and then finding parts of the story that can ensure that it will be retold again and again and again.
That's one of the reasons why I think that at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the story of Shifra and Puah, the two Egyptian midwives, is there. I really think that's why the story was inserted into the Torah, because it's so easy to make this a story of us against them. There was an old Israeli song that said, Kol ha'olam negdenu, the whole world is against us. Cynthia Ozick once wrote a piece in Esquire called The Whole World Wants Jews Dead. And it's so easy to fall into that trap. And I think the Torah very consciously wants to say, no, there are good people in the world. And you need to find them and you need to celebrate them. You're not the only moral people in the world. And you're not the perpetual victim of history. You have to correct the story. Go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, so I think the solution to that beautifully stated and agonizing problem is that without God in the story, in any of our stories, without God, there's really no hope that the story will be positive or enduring or healing. The reason God is put into the stories, the reason God is in the Exodus, as opposed to a bunch of Jews got out of Egypt, and it's about us, is that God provides a grounding for the story that is transnational. God provides the grounding to the story that's beyond Jews, that's beyond us, that's human, that's God's desire. And the rabbis make the point that it wasn't just Jews who left Egypt. It was an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude that left. A lot of Egyptians left because they were slaves too. And by adding God into the story, what we're saying is our story affirms the unity of all humanity. It could be read, and your examples are chilling in that any story can be read as, this is our story about our suffering, and we have to get revenge for our suffering and our story. That's the way it can be read. I lived, being older than both of you, I lived through the exact moment when the civil rights movement turned. It was, you know, the victory of Stokely Carmichael over Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X over King, and the way that King, people, and this I always say to them, do you realize it wasn't Dr. Martin Luther King, it was the Reverend Doctor. He was a minister. And the reason that the civil rights movement had Schwerner and the reason it had Goodman and Cheney, not Cheney, but Schwerner and Goodman and others and thousands of Jews, the reason it was able to reach out to others is that it was a religious movement. And it was King who put God into that story. It was King who said, not by the color of, in his greatest speech, which no one quotes that part, where he just blows up identity politics, crushes it forever, saying, I don't want my children to grow up where they're judged by the color of their skin. I want them to grow up where they're judged by the content of their character. And what he meant, but people didn't see it because they refused to see him as a minister. They wanted to see him as some kind of historical icon. And that just didn't work. And it's true in every great liberation. It was true in Gandhi's liberation. It was true in the teaching of the Buddha. It's true in Judaism. It's true in Christianity, that the story has God in it so that it doesn't become a source of ethnic shame, pride, anger, and vengeance. With God in it, it becomes a story of God's desire to see all of us free.
Whoa. My grandparents had a big photo of Martin Luther King on their living room wall.
Yeah.
Because my Bubby was convinced he was Jewish. And I would say, Bubby, he's not Jewish. He's a minister of the gospel. It's the Reverend King. She said, oh no, these, you know, and basically in her broken English, Yiddish, she said, these people know oppression. They're Jews. Yeah. Right. And she adopted him. Same thing with Cesar Chavez. His picture was on the refrigerator. So we remember why we don't eat grapes and lettuce, because he was also from the Jews, you know, because.
And tell the Heschel story about King and Heschel.
No, but it's the idea, though, is that my Bubby understood what you just said. My Bubby got this notion that this was not a struggle of black people against white people. This was a struggle of all people for dignity. And we know that struggle. We've lived it. We've suffered through it.
That's how you fix the Holocaust. If the message of the Holocaust, if the story of the Holocaust is never again us, never again Jews, never again a worldwide genocide against the Jewish people, then that story will fade into history. But if it's a story about never again anyone, never again a genocide against any human being, then the Holocaust will be lifted up and it will be a totally different story. I once, listed all the genocides that have happened since the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's pretty awful.
And the pathetic response of the Jewish community, organized Jewish community, to most of these genocides, from Biafra to Uganda to everywhere. And that is very, very troubling, because when you really look at what are the foundations for Jewish identity today in terms of just surveys, the Holocaust is one, and Israel is another. That's the two big foundational.
It's the reason why Rabbi Schulweis founded the World Watch, Jewish World Watch, is because he was embarrassed that we go around speaking about never again, and yet there's one going on right in front of us.
Right.
In Darfur, and then in the Congo, and then now with the with various other, the Rohingya in Burma and the Uyghurs in China, and you have this going on about the world, all about the world. This week we experienced a number of profound events. And I don't want to get into the politics, but there wasn't a unique moment this last week at the inauguration of President Biden, when a young woman from here in Los Angeles rose to give a poem. And it was an astonishingly beautiful poem and an astonishingly beautiful performance. Sherre, I know you have a connection with her.
It's been well written that Amanda Gorman, the Nobel Youth Laureate, was part of a group called Write Girl, WRITE Girl. It is a group in which high profile writers mentor very actively young writers, young poets, young authors. You apply to it when you're in 8th grade. It's very competitive. It's mostly for people of color and of low income. But we do have a connection, Eddie, because my daughter applied for it as a white Jewish girl from a middle-class family. And when she was in 4th grade, she saw them perform. And she told us, I'm going to be in that group. And my husband and I were like, does she know that she's not a person of color? Like, does she know that that's not open to her? And she went to her interview and she said, I'm not represented here. I don't see me here. And they accepted her. So she's in her 4th year of Write Girl. 100% of those girls go to college. They have a huge program in place, many of them to the best colleges in the country. And many of those girls come from truly nothing. I don't know Amanda's background, but they really nurture their ability to write, whether it's poetry, prose, screenwriting, myth, whatever. And so I'm so proud that my daughter is in it. She didn't know Amanda because Amanda's a couple classes ahead of her, but they usually know, 3 up, 3 down kind of. So she has a lot of friends who know her.
There was a part of the poem. Could you enlighten me? Because my memory is fading, as it will for yours as well. And I share with you your praise of her poem. I loved it. I loved the performance. I particularly loved the way she was able to present a poem that was angry but not vengeful. That's an extraordinary distinction, very fine distinction, and she made it work. But did she mention God at all in her poem? My remembrance is she did not. And that's my concern. My concern is the point I just made. But if she mentioned
it, doesn't say God. She says Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree. So she mentioned Scripture. I'm looking back to see if there's any mention of God. She talks about faith.
Faith in God, yeah.
She talks about faith.
Like any speech the king ever gave. See, so if that's, and I don't mean in any way to have this seem like a criticism, it's simply to say that in our secular age, this tell your child it's what God did for me when I left Egypt is at the core of what it's going to take to bring our country into a new flourishing, what I will call a flourishing of centrism, in which America flourishes with its common beliefs. And one of those beliefs is that we are made, in the image of God, each of us equally, each of us holy, and that belief that the state doesn't give us our rights, the state doesn't give us our dignity, the state doesn't do this for us, God does this for us. To me, that's the way out of this. That's been the way out from the 60s, which formed me, and it's the way out now. So it's wonderful, but forgive me, just a tad troubling when the best and the best and the best of the younger generation don't perhaps drink from the waters of salvation the same way. Mimaneha Yeshua, and I fear for that.
Yeah,
because
I didn't.
The others aren't as beautiful as she is,
I get
as
it.
eloquent.
I hear what you're saying, but I didn't hear it as an angry poem, and I didn't miss God in the poem. I cherished her hope. I just cherished a word of hope. Hope is hard to come by these days. Hope is rare. You know, you're in the middle of a vicious pandemic, a terrible economic turndown, a political upheaval, a division in the country which is brutal. She's standing on a dais looking out, not at thousands of people gathered to celebrate the new president, but at hundreds of thousands of flags and 4,000 stanchions of that represent 400,000 dead from this. I mean, hope is hard to come by, Marc, and she expressed a deep and abiding hope in this country, a deep and abiding hope in
I
the
agree.
world.
Amen. Amen to
And
that. But let me just say one point about this.
I think it was worthy. It was a
Yeah.
sacred moment with God or without. It was a sacred
Well,
expression. We can
I
disagree. Go ahead.
would have. I'll tell you the story. So I was talking to Christopher Hitchens once, and I said, "Look, your arguments are great against a religion that only people who have not advanced after second grade understandings that God is an old man sitting on a cloud, and you destroy all that, and congratulations." But I said, that's not Spinoza's faith. That's not Maimonides' faith, and that isn't my faith. And he said, fair enough, fair point. I said, so let me ask you, without God in the world, without God in your life, what is the source of your hope? Silence. And he looks at me and he said, Marc, that is the best question. And so that's my response, was that here is the greatest atheist of our time, the most eloquent atheist, the most eloquent speaker I'd ever actually heard, the best debater I'd ever heard. And he was looking for hope. And there was a way for him to find it, but he had cut off the way that hope arrives. Hope isn't a flower that lives in the air. It must be rooted in something. Flowers grow out of the ground, and the ground of hope is faith in God, that God has created all people in the image of God with equal dignity, with equal holiness. Without that, and so that's why when someone speaks, especially in poetry, especially in such a wonderful, moving poem, and I look forward as she grows, what is she, 21 now?
22, yeah.
22. I look forward as she grows to see whether she has the need to explore other sources of hope that are slightly more divine.
Look, far be it from me to offer a defense of the godless, but I got to tell you that I've actually stood on the steps of that building, not at an inauguration, just as a tourist, and been moved tremendously. I've stood at the Lincoln Memorial and been moved tremendously. And I didn't need, I mean, in the sense, I didn't need God language at that point. There was something transcendent and powerful at that moment, that there is something godly in the American faith and democracy. There is something godly in the principles that underlie these buildings and these monuments. There's a reverence at that moment that I could feel, and I felt it coming through her words in an idiom that was brand new. You know, echoes of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, echoes of rap music. I felt in this young woman's power of poetry and vision, you know, an echo of something that my teacher would call godly if it wasn't exactly in God language, because
Look, let me be clear. I loved her. I
no,
loved
no,
her
I'm not.
poem.
I'm just saying.
I'm not
I
criticizing your
think
poem.
that there is hope. There are sources of hope that don't demand God language at that moment. Sherre, what do you think? You get the last word about this one.
So I would just say that to me, whether you invoke God's name does not make it whether it's spiritual or faith or hope. I think there are sacred moments, and I think she truly made that moment sacred through her words. I think she instilled hope in a country that feels hopeless. I think she instilled faith in a time when people feel faithless, and I think she did it in a stunning way, because whether I was watching with my 11-year-old boy, and when he saw this young woman, and I think her years are I think she's got a soul of an 80-year-old. So what's to come is, I mean, she's extraordinary. But I was watching with my 11-year-old and he was like, Mom, she's not old. It was like just seeing that response, like he could see himself, I think was very powerful.
Right. Right. And let's finish on a less serious note. We noted this week the death of a figure who was a remarkable figure, a baseball player by the name of Hank Aaron, who played for the Milwaukee Braves, and then they moved to Atlanta, who held the record for home runs for a very long time, who many believe may have been the greatest baseball player of all, who was a real icon for civil rights, a symbol of the power of civil rights to include people of color in this community. And I know that meant a lot to you, Marc, right?
He was my favorite player. I grew up. I would write the scores of every game with my dad. We would go to Milwaukee County Stadium and watch him play. He was elegant. Nowadays there's all this technology. People wear batting gloves. He wore no batting gloves. People put pine tar on the bat. He put nothing on the bat. It was pure. He was a pure genius on the field. But it reminds me that in some ways sports has replaced religion in a way in our culture, in a way that is in its early days, it was a good thing because people were also religious in large numbers, much more so than today. And what sports did and what baseball did is it gave you a team to root for where the color of the skin of the players was irrelevant. I mean, in all the eulogies about Hank Aaron that are coming out, they're now, of course, it's all about, he got 3,000 hate letters a day of people because he was about to break the most important sports record in American history, which was Babe Ruth's home run record of 714. And on April 8th, 1974, he did it. And so there's a lot of focus on the racial element of Henry Aaron, but the truth of the matter is, and I can say this, I never thought of him, of course I knew he was black, but I never thought of him as a black man. He was my right fielder on my team. He was my right fielder. And that's what sports can do in its best levels, when it's performed not by self-serving multimillionaire egomaniacs, but when it's performed by people who are humble and who are reverential toward the game and its history. And Hank Aaron was like that. And he changed me. He showed me what it was like just to play a game perfectly. And his very, very mature and patient and wise and courageous swallowing of the shame that his record was broken by a man who did it while aided by steroids. That tragedy fades away because in time, no one will think highly of the man who broke his record and whose name I won't even say. But they will think increasingly highly and with great praise and justified praise of a man who came from Mobile, Alabama, and entered professional baseball with 2 sandwiches in his pocket, and who played the game perfectly, and who gave me joy, and who gave me a team. And having a team makes all the difference.
Marc, such a beautiful story. You took us right back to what Eddie said at the beginning. Taking history and making it memory is when we become a part of the story. And you truly, through Hank's memory, did that today for all of us. So thank you. And thank you, Eddie, for always helping us make history memory.
Well, thank you, Sherre, and thank you, Marc, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. So this afternoon, following our Torah study this morning, of course, we have Shabbos morning service right here on Facebook or YouTube. This evening, tonight, Valley Beth Shalom and the community of our Jewish community remembers the wonderful legacy of Rabbi Harold Schulweis, on the occasion of his 6th yahrzeit. It's at 7 o'clock tonight here on Facebook and YouTube. And following that program, please join me for a Zoom chat. And we'll share some stories about Rabbi Schulweis's legacy. I'd be glad to answer questions about his philosophy, interpretations of Judaism. That's 7 o'clock tonight, a tribute, a commemoration, a celebration of the remarkable life and Torah of Rabbi Harold Schulweis. Of course, this week, Minyan tomorrow morning, Sunday morning at 8:30, every other morning at 7:30 in the morning, every night at 5. My Lunch and Learn on Wednesday at 12:30. We're learning the books of Ketuvim, the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible. And on Wednesday night, Jewish Life Awakens with Rabbi Noah Kushner and with me. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to Rabbi Sherre, to Rabbi Marc, and to everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.